This is a part 2 for how to use the Loft tool from Arceon. If you don't know anything about the Loft command, I recommend you go watch my first video where I explain it in greater detail. In this part 2, I'm going to demonstrate it in more specific ways, assuming you already know how to use it. If you don't have Arceon, it is a plugin you can get from Arcaniax's Patreon, or there are a couple servers such as Builders, Refuge, and the Bakery where you can apply to be able to use this plugin. It is so easy to build grass with Loft and so efficient, I use this all the time. All you have to do is select a series of frames in a random order vertically, and that's it. The trick is knowing how your selection can affect the way the grass looks. For example, if you wanted to have straight blades of grass, you would use 2 points per frame. If you want your blades of grass to be more curved, I recommend doing at least 3 points per frame. The other thing to consider is length. Do you want short grass or tall grass? However you want it to go, that's how you would make your Loft selection. Although typically when I'm making grass, I try to make all of the frames relatively the same height. Once you know how tall the grass should be and whether you want it to curve or not, you're just going to select a bunch of these frames vertically from the ground. And I'm going to kind of go in a zigzaggy pattern or really just a random pattern in a little cluster. It doesn't have to be in a cluster, but you can get a thicker clump of grass by doing it this way. There is no set number of frames you have to make, but the more frames you do, the more grass you can add. And once you have your crazy wavy selection all done, all you have to do is set this with some kind of count. What the count does is it will divide your selection into multiple segments, and since we've selected these vertically, they shoot out like blades of grass. The higher the count, the more blades of grass will appear. Now you want to be careful with this because if you have too many blades of grass, you can visibly see the path the Loft is following. I like to choose a count that makes it less obvious that there was any kind of path that I was creating with the Loft. So if you need to adjust the count so the grass isn't too close to each other, I would do that. And if you wanted thicker grass in a single section, you could add more frames to your Loft or start a new selection. It can be very time consuming to cover a large area like this, but another thing you could also do is just make grass assets and then copy and paste those all around if you needed a bunch of them. For my summer dragon build I did where I covered this whole hill with grass, all of that grass had to be individually made because of the shape of the hill it was covering. Because of that, I wasn't copying and pasting anything, and I did all of it with Loft. It ended up taking me quite a few hours to do. So even though this is a fast process for doing grass, if you're doing a large area of it and you're not copying and pasting, it can be time consuming still, and still greatly efficient. One of my favorite types of plant assets to make with Loft is ferns. You can do them 100% with Loft minus the texturing, and it's so easy to do. Let's add an extra leaf onto this existing fern I already have. First, we'll have to make a stem, and you can do this with Loft if you only left click. I'm going to create a curve just by left clicking, so I'm creating new frames, but not adding points to those frames. And then I can set that like a normal Loft, but it will only create a single curve. Of course, you could do it with the curve command too. It's just kind of neat that you can streamline the process and do it with Loft as well. Next, I'm going to draw a basic outline of where I want the edges of the leaf to be. I like to make myself a little guideline first. So I'm figuring out the shape of the overall fern leaf. And then I'm going to set this to some kind of placeholder block and use the -O flag to outline it. This helps me see where the edges of the leaf are, but I can also go back and change it easily enough. Now I'm going to select crosswise across the entire leaf shape. I have to select in this direction so that when we add a count to this, the lines will follow in the same direction. So once I have that all filled up, I'm just going to do Loft set with a block and count number. If you wanted to mask error, you could do so here as well. And then I'll get a series of lines going across. You can add a higher count if you want them closer together, or a smaller count if you want them more spread out. You could also go back and adjust the way you select frames. If you wanted them to be more angled coming from the center, you would just have to select your points in a more angled fashion, because any direction you select the points is the direction that these lines will go. And for my example here, I don't like how wide it is in some areas, so I did carve a bit of it away. But once I have that, I can remove my placeholder and quickly texture this just by painting along the edges with another block. It's a very fast way of making a fern leaf, but it still can take a while to make an entire plant with this method. It does take a little bit of patience, but I think it always turns out better in the end when you're making individual leaves instead of copying and pasting everything. Although this particular leaf I just made kind of ruined the shape of my fern, but you still get the idea. There's all kinds of different leaf shapes you could make following these same basic principles of using count and outline. All it takes is a little bit of imagination and even some hand carving in some cases. Remember, Loft is good for the foundation of many things, but it still will involve some input from you as a builder to add your own personal touches to it. To start my firework, I'm going to create a large hollow sphere using glass. This is to give myself a basic guideline for how big of an explosion I want. Be sure that you do have a block in the center of the sphere because you will need it to click on for your Loft command. I'm going to use paper to make my first point in the middle, a second point somewhere on the glass, and a third point outside of the glass. So really the glass is just there to help give me a guide. And the distance between the glass and the last point, I am eyeballing that and just trying to guess where that distance would be. But as I'm selecting these points, I'm also thinking about the curvature of the lines I'm making. The first half of each frame will be straighter because the particles are moving faster from the center, and the further out they go, gravity will take hold and they'll start to curve. You really just need to consider how gravity is affecting all of these particles. And not all fireworks are made the same. I'm just using a waterfall type of firework as an example. With all of that in mind, I'm going to select a whole bunch of frames. The more frames I add, the more random my particles will be. Then I'll set the loft using a count number similar to what we did with the grass. Then I'm going to repeat this same process until I fill in 1/4 of the sphere. And once I have that quarter filled, I can go into the middle and revolve it 4 times using the revolve command from Arceon, which I have a tutorial for too if you want to learn how to use that. And then you'll have a fully formed firework. If you wanted to add some additional detail to this, you could take a sphere brush that is a mixture of air and then whatever block you're using and brush that around to make it look like the particles are more spread out. And for this first one, I replaced it with end rods just as a particle effect and also gives it a glow at night. If you wanted to add some color to your firework, you could also mix in some glass. There's a lot of ways you could texture this, but most of what I'm using to texture it is with Go Paint or some kind of sphere brush. Then when you look at these at night, they glow very nicely, especially with shaders. The end rods are perfect because with those you don't have to really add additional lights, and they also look like very fine particles in the sky. Candles would also work really well because it not only gives you light, but also adds additional colors. I'm going to show you a basic way to create a dragon wing shape with Loft. This dragon has one wing extended and one folded because you do them in slightly different ways. Let's start with the folded one first. On this one, I'm going to start near the top and select my frames down one side of the wing shape that I have made. It's helpful to have a skeletal structure of the wing done before doing anything with Loft. And I'm going to add a second frame a little further out but down the middle of this, and a third frame along the next skeletal part of the wing. The one thing you have to remember with the wing shaped like this is that it is collapsing, so all of this membrane in between each of these structural pieces is going to be more collapsed or folded. So when looking at it from the front, it should cave in a little ways because it does have extra length to it that we're just not seeing, so it needs to curve. Before we set the loft, make sure to G-mask air just so you're not destroying any of the other blocks around it. Then go ahead and loft set to whatever placeholder block you want to use. Then repeat this on the last 2 sections using the same formula. Remember, my dragon here isn't too big, so I don't need to make this curve too drastic, but the larger your organic, the more extra membrane folded back you could include. It really depends. Something to keep in mind after all of this is when looking at it from the back, you'll have to make sure that you can still see the skeletal structure in between all of these loft shapes. I'm sure it is perfectly realistic to have the membrane covering the framing of the wing in some areas, but I like to make sure it is visible in other areas too, just because it brings it all together and makes it look all connected. Ignore the fact that this wing is much bigger than the other one. This is purely for an example and the proportions are not accurate. But for a wing that is more spread out like this one, you're going to be doing the same thing by following along the skeletal structure of the wing with Loft, but this time I'm not doing the additional third frame in between each section. Because this wing is more spread out, the membrane on this will need to be a lot tighter, so it doesn't need that additional give to it. And just as a reminder, don't forget to Gmask air before setting this loft. I want to show you how you can improve on the shape of this once you have it set. Because it is making a straight edge from point A to point B, that is not what we want for this wing. Typically it should be more curved, and you could go in by hand and make that curve shape yourself, or another way you could consider doing it is using Go Paint or some kind of sphere brush with glass, going over that loft shape and creating a curve into it. This way, if you did mess up on it, you could always undo more easily and redo it. Once you think you've created a good enough curve shape on that, then you can select that glass or whatever placeholder you're using and delete it, and then you've got your nice curved edge to that loft. Now I'm going to do the last two sections the same way, where I'm masking air when setting a loft, then mask the placeholder block when brushing some glass on it to shape it. Also, just like before, make sure the skeletal structure in between here is also visible from all angles and isn't getting concealed by these other blocks. I got this far into the wing making when I realized I didn't show you how to connect the wing to the body, and this is an important step because I didn't even show it in the first wing I showed you. For this spread out wing I have, I'm going to connect it to the body using Loft, starting a frame near the center of the last section of the wing that we made. And then I'm going to create a frame that curves down and touches the body. It needs to be a little distance away from where the base of the main wing structure is. And then I'm going to make a second frame that connects to that base. The width of this really depends on how big your dragon is and how big your wings are. Personally, I think the one I made here is a little too small, but this is also a shape that you could have done all at once with the last loft selection, but I had to tack it on at the end because I completely forgot about it. So however you add it, just make sure you are adding it because this is more accurate to a dragon's anatomy. And if you want to see how that would look on the folded wing, it's the same concept, but over here the wing is much smaller. Again, the proportions on here are kind of off, but I'm just using this as an example. That's a basic way to do dragon wings. Remember, how loose or tight you make that membrane really depends on the angle of the wing itself and how much wind is flowing through it and all of that. To create water with Loft, the number one thing you have to think about is what direction is the water flowing. Once you figure that out, you can start lofting the water. Water can flow in many ways, but I want to show you specifically how to make a wave like I did in my winter dragon build. For these water splashes, I create a series of frames in my loft that all go the same direction, and I want to make sure as I'm selecting these frames that it's not creating a very flat shape. So there really is no specific shape I'm making other than I'm thinking about it's flowing like water. Maybe it starts off small and then widens towards the end. It really depends on your composition and where your water is coming from, how you're going to shape it. But as a general rule, the water will spread out more the farther out it goes. Once you've created a series of frames, then you're going to set that loft and you'll see the shape that you have created. And what I like to do to further shape this to look like water is create an airbrush with Worldedit. So that's just brush sphere 0 with a very small size, maybe 1 or 2. And then I'm going to also mask whatever block I use to create the loft, just so I don't accidentally brush on other things. And I'm going to start carving out different shapes on the water just on the end, because you have to think about the water spraying out from the main shape of the wave. So I'm just trying to create a spraying effect here and carving into it and shape it that way. I also like to use another sphere brush that has air and the base block mixed into it as a material. That's going to add some noise to the tips of the wave to look like a misty effect. One thing you have to make sure you're not doing is keeping the end of the original loft shape intact. What I mean by that is you want to make sure you're carving and shaping this enough where the end of the original loft shape is no longer straight. You have to think about it as being an organic flowing shape that's ever changing and doesn't have an immediate stop to it. While using these two things alone does create an interesting looking wave, it still could be better. So another thing I like to add on top of this, to add even more mist, is using a sphere brush that has mostly air with some blocks mixed in, but instead of masking on top of the existing blocks, we are actually placing some of these blocks down. So I'm basically brushing giant spheres of blocks on top of my loft shape, and then I'm going back and forth between adding those and then carving some of it away with another airbrush. It really is a lot of back and forth of adding blocks, then carving them away. You are shaping this water's destiny. The benefit of adding additional sphere brushes on top of the loft is that it keeps it from being confined to that straight edge that the loft shape made, and it helps spread out the water more and makes it look more natural. I feel like I'm just repeating myself a lot here, but I'm trying my best to explain this in a way that makes sense. Hopefully the visuals also help you understand what I'm saying. Once you have a wave shape you're happy with, then you can go in and color it really quickly. I like to color the misty part with some kind of glass. You can always add more layers to this to make it more detailed. And for these particular waves, I painted streaks of a different solid block onto them and then made the base block out of glass. You could have done the loft originally with glass, I just didn't, so you could see it more easily here. I feel like this wave I made here is a very stylized one. It's not what you would typically do. It really depends on your build and application of making a wave. But I think using Loft with a combination of different brushes to create a mist is a very quick and efficient way of making water. As I was figuring out what examples to show for this video, I received this comment. And honestly, it's been a while since I've done armor, but I think if I were to do it again, I would definitely use Loft. At least for larger pieces of armor. If it's something really small, you could get away with doing it by hand. The first step I recommend you do when building armor is to collect a plethora of references to build from. I used a reference to create my own references, and I'm going to use these references to build from. I am just going to build this chest plate and these arm plates for this example, but the same rules apply to any piece of a suit of armor. Step 2 is to have a base model built, whether you built it yourself or never mind, you should have built it yourself. Shame on you for stealing a model. Have your model built. It doesn't have to be perfect as long as the proportions are mostly accurate, because we are going to be covering it with armor. Looking back at my reference, I have to dissect this into smaller pieces. It would be too challenging to do the whole thing at once. I'm going to start with just the front half of the chest plate, basically just 1/4 of it. In this particular example, my armor will be symmetrical, meaning I will copy, flip, and paste to the other side. Even if your model is going to be more dynamically posed, I recommend building the armor straight first and then rotating it after the fact. That way you're keeping consistent with your proportions. Before I make my actual loft selection, I'm going to mark off where I think each point will go with a block. This will save me a lot of trial and error trying to make this loft selection mid-air. It's a much faster way to visualize the selection before I make it. Once I have those mapped out decently, I think this is good, I can go ahead and make my loft selection. I don't think it would make too much of a difference which direction you make your selection from, whether it be top to bottom or left to right. I'm going vertically here because I like to go the direction of the longest length. I don't know if that's really a rule or if it's just what seems the most natural to me, but that is what I'm doing here. When you set this loft, there's a couple things to keep in mind. You might want to set your global mask to air just so you don't destroy any of your model underneath. And also when I'm setting this, I'm going to be adding the -p flag for polygon shapes, because if you look at my particular reference, you'll notice these sharp points that appear throughout the line work. And this is purposeful to show that there are straight edges to this armor. And the best way to get those straight edges is to use the -p flag. With this piece set, you can see how those polygon shapes look, and I think it looks pretty close to my reference and it looks good. And it's covering my model, which is another important thing to keep an eye out for. Now I'm just going to repeat that same process for the rest of the chest plate. I'm going to start in the back and then do the shoulder portion. For complex shapes like this, I think it is easier to split it into smaller sections and just loft a little bit at a time. It leaves less room for error. Now I just have to do that little piece of trim along the bottom. I'm doing this one separately because I knew for a fact I did not want to use the -p flag for this. Otherwise, I probably could have added it with another selection. With that done, I can now copy, flip, and paste this piece. From here, you could rotate it if desired. Chances are you'll have to clean up the model when rotated, but you will want to wait to texture it until it's in the final position you want it to be. I'm now going to do the same thing for other pieces. You saw how I split the individual pieces in my reference. And this is kind of obvious, but just as a reminder, you want to build the inside pieces first. So if something needs to layer on top of other ones, you want to build those sections last. Trying to think of any other tips I could give on this, maybe just take your time with the mapping out stage. The more clearly you can visualize the shape before even making a loft, the much easier and less frustrating it will be. I think it's more frustrating to try to make the loft selection over and over again with no clear goal in mind. So you have to either be able to visualize it in your head or use blocks to help you visualize it, and it will make the process much smoother. I now have my upper body armor fully built, but I wanted to give you some bonus tips on possible ways to texture this. The first thing I did try when texturing it was creating a lighten brush. This is Fast Async Worldedit, if you're wondering. So I'm creating this brush with Fast Async, and what it will do is it will automatically pick blocks that are lighter than the ones I'm painting on and naturally lighten up the shading of it. However, when I was using it on these gray blocks, it was creating a lot of green tints that just didn't look quite right. So I stopped using that, and instead, this is what I did. I painted some white blotches in places where I thought the armor should be shinier, and then I used the blend pattern from Arceon to create a blending brush that is just brush sphere with a blend pattern and a size. I used that to blend those white shapes into the gray all around it, and that gives it a nice overall shiny gradient on all of these surfaces. It is a bit too blurry in some of these areas. That's why I went over it again with a solid block just to add a sharper shine to some of these spots. I didn't spend very much time at all in this texturing. I threw it together in just a few minutes, just as an example, but I think it gives you an idea of how you could go about doing it. As a bonus, I'm going to show you how to do a little red cape on the back of this armor. When I'm doing a cape or anything that has a lot of folds in it, I use the same principle of splitting it into smaller sections, just because when you're making a lot of points in a row, it can be very time-consuming and frustrating when you mess up. I think this makes it easier to redo something if you do make a mistake. Something I try to do when I want to have a lot of folds is make sure that each frame I'm selecting is going forward, then back, then forward, so they're not all going perfectly straight. I'm actually trying to make them wave a little bit as I'm selecting them. Also, if I make a really horrendous mistake, like part of the loft was sticking up way too far in this case, I will destroy the offending section and patch it up with a smaller loft. I do this all the time, especially when I'm lofting a very large piece of cloth. It's not always necessary to restart the entire thing. You could just destroy the part that looks the worst and patch it up. I did go in here and adjust some of these edges by hand as well. I would have spent more time on it if I actually cared about this build, but as far as examples go, I think this is good enough.
If you watched this video all the way through, then you must be really dedicated to learning more about Loft, and I applaud you. These are just a few of the many examples for how you can use Loft, and I hope you are able to learn something from it. If you have other specific examples you'd like to share with others, you could comment them down below. Otherwise, I wish you the best on your building project, and maybe I will see you again someday. Bye!